physical and or sexual intimate partner violence or non-partner sexual violence in their lifetime. The United Nations, on the other hand, reports that 35% of women have faced sexual harassment, but fewer than 40% seek help, and less than 10% reach out to law enforcement agencies in their respective countries. Women often report harassment and seek help from the courts, and almost never none of these cases ever come out positively as they would have expected. We have just witnessed partly a successful case for an American superstar, P. Diddy, in the US, where his triumph in court has been associated, or rather attributed, to his power socially, and indeed that power being based on the financial success that he enjoys. We are following another case in South Africa where a judge, president, has been accused of the same thing, sexual harassment. He's denying that. He's saying none of that is put across as a crime he committed. He says that none of that makes sense to him. And here at home, of course, recently we had a case where a lover went to the University of Botswana seeking to find his lover who was working for that institution. And what happened became tragic. That woman is no longer alive, and the man is in the hands of the police. On the Atlas today, we have someone who is going to help us understand or be able to analyze, for the purpose of understanding, what really makes it difficult for women to emerge as winners in cases that they raise, those who get the courage to actually raise these matters. Sociologist Nyakallo Lekuta is here to help us unpack these complexities and how GBV, or gender-based violence, can be successfully contained. Lekuta, thank you very much for making time for the Atlas.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's first look at what we cited above, the three incidents that we talked about earlier. There have been calls and pressure on government to declare GBV a crisis. Yeah. And with that, the UN data representing, and I'll just share this with you, the UN data representing the global picture of GBV is that we're at a crisis. And one wonders, what will it take for the situation to be put under control?
Okay. Thank you again for having me. And definitely I concur with those statistics as the evidence that it indeed is a crisis. To corroborate some of those stats additionally, 67% of women in Botswana indicate having experienced abuse. And then that's also confirmed by 44% of our men here who indicate having propagated such abuses. Now we're talking about declaring a crisis. And when we do this, what we're asking for is the efforts of the government to demonstrate commitment, to resource, to mobilize, to show us technical steps in which they are invested in eradicating this crisis. As you recall, the previous administration also did say that GBV is a crisis, but we still haven't quite seen the results of their efforts. Hopefully, with this new administration, we can see technical steps, including the allyship with community leadership and organizations that are proximity to our families, that influence our leaders to eradicate this kind of behavior, the financial resourcing of organizations that are equipped to specifically address GBV, and finally, the educational interventions that come much earlier before it's too late to eradicate the mentality that leads to GBV.
So it is a position that, based on these statistics, GBV is a crisis? has reached crisis level?
I would say statistically it seems to be the case. We've seen that consistently. Unfortunately, Botswana has held a position as being considered a rape capital around the globe relative to other countries, right? You consider how infinitesimally small our population is. That's very drastic. We also have the fact that we realized just in our past festive season, we had 2 weeks where in just 14 days, we came from the festive season where there were 60 rapes, 19 murders, and 13 defilements. So I would say definitely it is a crisis.
Let's consider the case that I referred to earlier on in the US involving one of the superstars in the music industry, the P. Diddy, where he faced cases of, accusations of racketeering, conspiracy. It went further to, it basically became very serious cases. And people were disappointed that he was absolved of any guilt in the most cases that you could say serious. And then the question is, what are we learning, or what is making it difficult for the accusers to carry the day in court?
Okay. Well, I think definitely that might be twofold. Initially, I would say that we have significant gaps in our legislation that allow cases to fall through the cracks based on instances like technicalities, based on definitions, based on specifics regarding the chosen cases. It can be the case also that with lack of social support from the judicial process, victims can retract their statements, amend their statements, or just refuse to continue complying based on fear, intimidation, or not having enough information on what tools they have at hand at their dispensation. I think the other thing that comes to be the case is that we have instances whereby people don't have the education about their options, and so it is difficult to mobilize a mentality of case reporting.
Okay, so when you say that technicalities sometimes contribute towards letting those who are accused to escape, isn't that just part of the judicial system, that technicalities are part of that, and that whoever has a what you call brilliant lawyer is most likely going to win even by technicality, and it's allowed by law?
That instances tends to indicate a circumstance we have where we do have to revise our legislation to prevent that, right? When you have hard, conclusive, and very thorough evidence to be able to impugn that in the judicial process. The instance comes where we have a process that doesn't allow that to be applied. For example, regarding the Sean Diddy Combs case. What the state has showed us is that it was able to put aside gender-based justice in favor of prioritizing the dismantling of corrupt or criminal organization. So we did have confirmed gender-based violence, but that got ignored in favor of the criminal charges regarding his enterprise.
Mm-hmm. So I want us just to wrap up on this point, that people argue that this will eventually influence or cause many women not to rise up and report cases, because they've seen those that we have lost when they had the courage to report the cases. Mm-hmm. Isn't it that when you go to court, it is expected that either you win by convincing the judge or the magistrate, yes, or the one who is accused puts up a good defense and convinces the magistrate? Why should it be taken that if the accuser loses, then it is wrong? Well, isn't that applying look, the moment you accuse the person, actually the court should say, this person is wrong. Is that the message?
Unfortunately, there is a wave of prevalent ideology that has both very good aspects, but one that might not be helpful, as you're indicating. This is the one of believing the victims. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, we do have a judicial process that requires that it be completely absolved from courts of public opinion and mainly focused, essentially strictly focused on the evidence. That being the case, social movements have had impact in pressurizing or creating momentum in terms of convictions when it comes to accusations. But I believe it is that we are lucky when we preserve institutions that are separate from prevalent sentiments and focused on evidence per case.
As highly influential as the United States of America is globally, what is this case likely impact or influence in other countries? In similar cases like this one, the PDD one,
Okay.
the outcome.
Okay. Well, the verdict definitely has sent sound waves across oceans, especially with the prevalence of social media. We have access and we're privy to many relatable details of these cases for many people. So I would imagine that the verdict does have a sense of imbuing dejection, hopelessness, and feelings of powerlessness in victims. But I do return to the fact that each case is different and that the best way to achieve justice is to pursue it in the first place. And similarly, it is important that we indicate that these cases that we observe are examples but don't determine what one's personal outcome will ultimately be.
What does this say to you about the how the world looks at GBV?
Okay. Well, I think what we glean from these cases is the fact that the ones we just described in order, let's start with the one regarding the person who unfortunately took a life at one of our campuses in Gaborone. We realize that there is a need for increased protections for people who do come forward before it is too late. And then regarding the Sean P. Diddy case, we definitely see the importance of the judicial system having to align with the priority of addressing GBV along with other charges it prioritizes finding its wins on. And regarding the judge, of course, we have to address bias. We are seeing that there tends to be a lot of hesitation or pressure to go one way or the other in such cases with huge figures like this.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, in cases like, in countries like the USA, I mean, it is understood that jurisdictions there have strong laws and policies on GBV, such that you wouldn't expect to be some cracks that allow for perpetrators to go to escape. What would you say that explains this then, where in some cases the one who is accused eventually escapes without any guilt pronounced on them?
Okay. This returns to the fundamentals behind judicial processes. It is the case that being on a trial requires substantial, conclusive, and thorough evidence. So unfortunately, the matter of evidence, regardless of what merit or truth there may be to a case, can be compromised if evidence does not seem substantial enough. Additionally, there is the matter of the strength of representation. Depending on what you can afford, if you have a public defender or somebody who's very skilled and successful at the practice of defending, you may find that you do lose your case based on not being able to retain very competitive talent to represent you.
Okay, let me remind you what Magistrate Kamogelo Messi just recently said about that case. She said that she took a swipe at Botswana's criminal justice, that was in the Yobi murder case.
Yes.
It had in part contributed towards the situation that we find ourselves in. Do you agree with that?
To an extent, I definitely do agree. And I agree in this regard. When we are looking at these processes, it's been commonly understood now, especially in the legal industry, that the time of processing or serving a restraining order is a very high risk period. It's very contentious and often is not received very well. With that knowledge, I think what the magistrate is trying to say is there are protocols we can put in place with that awareness to say that this is a high-risk time and we need to further advocate for and demonstrate support for these victims who've come forward.
Okay, and I just want to bring that close to what, because you said that what President Boko has just recently called, we need a holistic approach to GBV, perhaps the psychology of abuse, look into issues of cultural context and how we bring up children. And as a starting point, his suggestion is that that's where we have to start. What are your thoughts about his ideas as the nation looks for long-lasting solution?
The end point you just indicated is the most important. And I appreciate the president taking this academic lens at looking at how we're going to address GBV, this crisis, right? We're looking for strategic solutions. I do think being holistic in our approach is going to prevent us just having reactions which are very short term and don't have any strategic value, but rather move us into the space of mitigation, prevention, and eradication, where we finally have solutions. Remember, we're not just trying to be punitive and punish. We're trying to prevent further victimization and conscription of further people to participate in these behaviors, and finally empower the rehabilitation and mitigate the gender gap we're experiencing. So I completely agree with him, and I'm excited to see in the future, upon declaring this a crisis, what kind of scale of intervention the government would uptake to meet this crisis.
Okay, and what if you were given an opportunity to make a contribution, where would you start?
In terms of the government?
Yes.
Okay, well, the crisis movement would definitely need very actionable steps that are very immediate. The first thing has to be the funding of the organizations that have been making concerted efforts to address this crisis, this nature of violence. They are skilled at it, they have the proceedings that they know are effective, and they have a familiarity with who has been vulnerable and how and why. The second thing I would do is take on digital presence. We need to have GPS tracking systems. Upon restraining orders, it's good to surveil and monitor the whereabouts of predators and past abusers. We also need to have probation periods, and we need to have interconnectedness digitally between various organs of law enforcement to have awareness of what kind of activity a person is taking. For example, monitoring digital activity. What are they posting? What conversations are they having? We get to have a preemptive take on the mind frame they have and evaluate risk actively as it is changing. And one final one that I would definitely think is very important is the psychosocial support of victims. Part of what you indicated earlier is the lack of success in cases, and sometimes it happens to be because of their part, and here's why. It happens to be that a lot of the time with this kind of violence that the victim ends up recanting or not complying anymore with a case. If we had enough psychosocial support for these victims, I believe they'd have an accurate awareness of what they've experienced and the risks going forward if they don't continue in the prosecution process, and thus make them much more equipped to continue and follow through.
Okay, let's end it with what the one American domestic abuse expert, Marquez, said just recently. She said, and I quote, that the juror's decision in the Diddy case is not just a stain on criminal justice system that for decades has failed to hold accountable abusers like Diddy, but also an indictment of a culture in which not believing women and victims of sexual assault remains endemic. How should the system be strengthened then to be able to deal justly with these complex or seemingly complex cases?
Right. I think this goes to the matter of priorities. When you declare crisis, it becomes a priority. But even without that, the judicial system needs to make a decision on how important it finds gender-based violence to start with. The racketeering case indicated to us that the state is quite willing to dismiss or put aside the justice for the gender-based violence in favor of pursuing dismantling corrupt enterprises. But that is an indication of the lack of priority, and I believe that this declaration of a crisis is going to start addressing instances like this.
Sociologist Nyakallo, Lekuta, thank you very much for your time, for helping us understand this. I think quite a lot of people have understood the perspective that you are putting across, that once you declare crisis, then the status quo cannot be, you need to show, even at policy level. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.